The world worshipped the platinum blonde bombshell, but Jean Harlow is actually a manufactured asset engineered by billionaire Howard Hughes. He patented her flesh, authorized the chemical burning of her scalp, and sold her to MGM for $60,000. Trapped between a studio that worked her into total organ failure and a family funneling her earnings to the mafia, she died a bankrupt hostage at 26. Executives didn't mourn. They hired a body double, finished the movie, and cashed in on her corpse. The acquisition phase was executed via a standard studio contract. The paperwork was a deed of sale. When the ink dried on the dotted line, the asset surrendered all copyright to her own anatomy, her bone structure, her epidermis, her respiratory system, her vocal cords. They were all legally transferred into the Hughes corporate portfolio. She was no longer a citizen. She was a patented invention. Hughes began the immediate redesign of the product. The blueprint was simple and brutal. He stripped the asset of all foundational garments. There would be no corsets, no brassieres, no cotton barriers to obscure the merchandise. He engineered a specific uniform. The silk dresses were cut on the bias to adhere to the flesh with the precision of shrink wrap. This was not a sartorial choice. It was a calculated, predatory marketing algorithm. The fabric was designed to glide over the hips and breasts, mapping the reproductive geometry of the asset for the global male consumer base. Every millimeter of exposed skin was calculated into the projected return on investment. The studio marketing department drafted the prospectus. They classified the asset as a bad girl. They manufactured a persona of loose morals and hypersexuality. It was a synthetic narrative engineered to bypass the cerebral cortex of the audience and trigger a base neurological response. Hughes flooded the market with promotional materials. He weaponized her image. He used her body as collateral to secure the box office receipts. The asset was deployed onto the sound stage. The lighting technicians were instructed to blast her with high wattage arcs, turning her hair into a beacon and her dress into a translucent display case. The cameras did not film a performance. They recorded a product demonstration. Hughes sat in the screening room, watching the dailies, auditing the footage with the cold calculation of an accountant reviewing a quarterly earnings report. He was checking the structural integrity of his investment. The initial production phase was successful. The raw material had been successfully processed into a functioning prototype. But a prototype requires rigorous, often destructive, testing to ensure market readiness. The physical integrity of the asset was entirely secondary to the visual output. The flesh was merely the casing for the brand. If the casing took damage during the manufacturing process, it was considered an acceptable overhead cost. The executives in the boardroom did not discuss art. They discussed profit margins, overheads, and depreciation rates. When the Harlow asset was brought into the discussion, she was evaluated exactly like a new fleet of delivery trucks or a shipment of raw celluloid. The men smoking cigars around the mahogany tables calculated her shelf life. They understood that flesh is a highly perishable commodity. Gravity, cellular aging, and metabolic decay would eventually render the product obsolete. The objective was to extract maximum financial yield before the biological expiration date arrived. The contract was an ironclad mechanism of control. It dictated her diet, her sleep cycle, her public appearances, and her resting heart rate. She was forbidden from engaging in any activity that might damage the corporate property. The studio owned the air in her lungs. They owned the specific curvature of her spine. They owned the chemical composition of her sweat. If she gained a pound of fat, it was a breach of contract. If she developed a blemish on her epidermis, it was a failure of maintenance. She was a machine operating on a leased lot. Hughes understood the volatile nature of his new acquisition, viewing her humanity not as a trait, but as a biological flaw. Nervous systems process stress. They process exhaustion. They process pain. Hughes implemented protocols to override these systemic vulnerabilities. The asset was instructed to stand under blistering studio lights for 18 hours a day. The heat from the tungsten bulbs baked the set, pushing the ambient temperature to suffocating levels. The asset was required to maintain a static, inviting facial expression, while her internal temperature spiked and her muscles cramped from dehydration. There was no union representation. There were no safety guidelines. There was only the daily quota. The camera rolled, capturing the exact amount of skin required by the distributors to guarantee theater bookings across the country. The asset performed her programmed routine. She hit her marks. She delivered the dialogue written by corporate scribes. She allowed the male co-stars to handle her chassis according to the director's schematic. Every time she was touched on screen, a cash register opened in the minds of the executives. They were monetizing human contact. They were selling the simulation of intimacy at a premium markup. The asset was a conduit for this transaction. She absorbed the gaze of millions, functioning as a lightning rod for the repressed desires of a bankrupt nation. The production of the aviation film finalized its principal photography. The asset had survived the initial manufacturing process. Her exterior remained unblemished. Her market value was untested but highly promising. Hughes prepared for the theatrical distribution. He prepared to unleash his manufactured narcotic upon the masses. He stood on the precipice of a massive return on investment, completely indifferent to the cellular toll the production had already taken on the young girl. The machine was primed. The product was sealed. The distribution channels were clear. The initial public offering of the asset was a staggering financial triumph. The aviation picture flooded the market. The capital returns were immediate and exponential. The Hughes corporate entity had successfully engineered a global fixation. The trademark was solidified. The brand identity was inextricably linked to a singular, highly specific physical trait: the hair. It was a synthetic shade of white gold. It did not exist in nature. The studio marketing division officially registered the moniker, the Platinum Blonde. It was no longer a descriptive term. It was a registered corporate asset. It was the primary driver of shareholder value. Maintaining this specific visual parameter required a rigorous and unrelenting maintenance schedule. A premium brand demands premium upkeep. The natural biological functions of the asset were in direct conflict with the trademark design. Human hair grows, it produces melanin, the roots emerge dark. This biological reality was classified as a defect in the manufacturing process. A dark root was a breach of brand consistency. It threatened the market valuation. The studio mandated a strict protocol to eradicate the defect. The maintenance bay was established in the subterranean levels of the makeup department. Every Sunday, the asset was required to report to the maintenance bay. This was not a cosmetic procedure. It was an industrial, chemical wash. The technicians assigned to the Harlow unit did not operate as beauticians. They functioned as hazardous materials handlers. They were tasked with executing a formula designed to strip the biological pigmentation from the keratin structure. The compound was brutal. It was volatile. It was highly corrosive. The primary ingredients were sourced from industrial supply chains. 20-volume peroxide, pure household ammonia, Lux soap flakes acting as a binding agent, Clorox bleach. These chemicals were manufactured to sterilize factory floors and strip oxidation from heavy machinery. They were never formulated for sustained contact with human epidermal tissue. The studio executives reviewed the chemical purchase orders. They audited the cost of the raw materials. The overhead was negligible. The profit margins generated by the platinum blonde trademark justified any necessary abrasive measures. The ledgers balanced perfectly. The asset was seated in the maintenance chair. Her head was tilted back over a porcelain basin. The technicians prepared the compound. The ammonia fumes immediately filled the unventilated room. The chemical vapor stung the mucous membranes of the handlers. They wore thick rubber gloves to protect their own skin from chemical burns. The asset possessed no such protective barrier. Her scalp was the target area. The application process commenced. The technicians used stiff bristle brushes to paint the toxic slurry directly onto the root structure. The mixture adhered to the scalp. The chemical reaction was instantaneous. The ammonia blasted open the hair cuticles. The peroxide penetrated the shaft. The Clorox eradicated the melanin cells. This reaction generated intense thermal output. The compound began to boil against the skin. Beneath the surface, the corrosive paste ate through the stratum corneum. The outermost protective layer of the epidermis dissolves. The chemical payload breaches the dermis. Nerve endings are flooded with highly caustic agents. The pain receptors fire agonizing signals to the cerebral cortex. The asset grips the armrests of the chair. Her knuckles turn white. Her respiratory rate spikes. She does not scream. Screaming is not conducive to the maintenance process. It would disrupt the application timeline. She endures the chemical burn with the stoicism of a machine undergoing a forced reboot. The paste sits on the scalp. It must remain active for a highly specific duration to achieve the trademarked shade of white. The biological tissue underneath is screaming. The capillaries just below the surface begin to rupture. Microhemorrhages occur across the entire cranial hemisphere. The body attempts to mount an immune response. It floods the damaged area with plasma. Clear fluid begins to weep from the compromised skin. Blisters form rapidly. The chemical compound continues to cook the flesh. The stench in the room shifts. The sharp odor of ammonia mixes with the distinct acrid smell of burning keratin and searing tissue. The asset's eyes water uncontrollably. The chemical vapor strips the moisture from her corneas. She stares at the ceiling tiles. She is dissociating. Her neurological system attempts to sever the connection to the localized trauma. The technicians monitor the clock. They are indifferent to the biological distress. Their sole objective is the preservation of the trademark. The required time elapses. The chemical phase is terminated. The extraction phase begins. Ice-cold water is blasted onto the raw, blistering scalp to halt the chemical reaction. The sudden temperature shift sends violent tremors through the asset's central nervous system. The technicians scrub the remaining paste from the roots. The scalp is revealed. It is an active disaster zone. The skin is a bruised, inflamed mass of weeping lesions and exposed tissue. Droplets of blood pool at the base of the hair follicles. The chemical burn has successfully eradicated the dark roots. The trademark is restored. The collateral damage is catastrophic. The keratin structures have been pushed beyond their tensile limits. The hair shafts are brittle, hollowed out by the bleach. They snap. Large clumps of dead white hair break off in the technician's hands. The asset is slowly going bald. The aggressive chemical stripping is destroying the follicles. The studio views this biological failure as an operational inconvenience. They deploy countermeasures. The makeup department is instructed to source high-quality hair pieces. They utilize strategic lighting on the soundstage to camouflage the thinning patches. The illusion of the platinum blonde must remain impenetrable to the consumer base. Hollywood lore insists the topical destruction was merely the visible fraction of a much deeper systemic poisoning. A persistent, gruesome rumor circulated through the industry that the weekly chemical baths seeped directly into her bloodstream, forcing her kidneys to filter pure industrial bleach. The myth dictates that the peroxide, the ammonia, and the raw chemical compounds entered the blood plasma, circulating through the central nervous system and slowly eroding the internal infrastructure of the prized asset. The medical reality, however, was less sensational but equally tragic. The foundation for her renal failure was laid years prior by a childhood bout of scarlet fever, creating a latent catastrophic vulnerability. Yet, the studio's relentless maintenance protocol acted as a lethal catalyst. The crushing schedule, the daily oral ingestion of synthetic amphetamines required to wake her, the heavy barbiturates needed to knock her out, and the systemic exhaustion pushed her fragile, already compromised internal architecture to the absolute brink. They did not technically poison her with hair dye. They simply worked a medically fragile girl until her organs surrendered under the weight of the corporate quota. The executives do not require medical reports, they require box office projections. The asset is dispatched back to the production floor immediately following the maintenance protocol. Her scalp is weeping fluid under the studio lights. The tight silk dresses chafe against her chemically burned skin. She is administered heavy doses of synthetic painkillers to maintain operability. The narcotics dull the searing pain in her cranium. They allow her to smile for the cameras. They allow her to execute the required physical maneuvers. The painkillers also add another layer of toxicity for the liver and kidneys to process. The systemic strain is escalating exponentially. The production line demands continuous output. The asset is scheduled for multiple consecutive film shoots. There is no recovery period factored into the ledger. The chemical maintenance must be performed weekly, regardless of the biological deterioration. The scalp never heals. The scabs are torn open by the stiff bristle brushes. Every Sunday, fresh bleach is poured into open wounds. The blood mixes with the ammonia. The asset learns to sleep sitting up to prevent the weeping sores on the back of her head from sticking to the pillowcases. Her vitality is being systematically drained. The heavy toxicity in her bloodstream begins to suppress her immune system. Her white blood cell count drops. Her body is expending massive amounts of energy attempting to repair the relentless chemical burns, leaving her vulnerable to secondary infections. She develops chronic fatigue. She suffers from severe upper respiratory issues. The studio doctors are deployed not to heal the asset, but to keep her functional. They administer adrenaline shots. They pump her full of vitamin complexes. They prescribe stronger barbiturates to force her into a chemically induced sleep cycle between production calls. She is a biological entity running entirely on synthetic fuel and sheer terror. The fear of contract termination is a highly effective motivational tool. Hughes and the studio executives ensure the asset understands her expendability. If the product fails to meet the trademark specifications, she will be liquidated. She will be discarded. The asset complies. She submits to the chemical burns. She swallows the narcotics. She stands under the lights and projects the calculated aura of sexual availability. The financial yield continues to climb. The Platinum Blonde brand generates unprecedented revenue. The public consumes the image voraciously. They purchase tickets. They purchase magazines featuring her trademarked hair. They are entirely oblivious to the industrial violence required to manufacture the image. The studio marketing department propagates the narrative of natural glamour. They bury the reality of the bleeding scalp and the failing kidneys. The maintenance protocol is classified as a standard operating procedure. The cost of the Clorox and ammonia is deducted from the gross profits. The slow, methodical poisoning of the 20-year-old girl is formalized as a necessary business expense. The asset is depreciating internally at a rapid velocity, but her external market valuation remains at a premium. The system is operating at peak efficiency. The machine is well-oiled. The raw material is being processed, refined, and converted into pure capital. The Hughes corporate entity monitors the stock price. The asset has generated massive returns. The initial investment has been recouped tenfold. However, market analysis indicates a potential plateau. The public appetite requires constant stimulation. The cost of maintaining the biological casing is increasing. The asset is becoming fragile. The internal infrastructure is showing early signs of systemic instability. The CEO evaluates the portfolio. A strategic decision is formulated. The asset has reached its maximum valuation under the current corporate structure. It is time to execute a major financial maneuver. It is time to capitalize on the inflated market value before the biological degradation becomes visible to the consumer base. The year 1932 commenced with a forensic evaluation of the Hughes corporate portfolio. The chief executive officer sat in a heavily secured boardroom and reviewed the physiological and financial data surrounding his most volatile asset. The Platinum Blonde brand had generated maximum initial yield. The box office receipts were securely deposited. The global market had consumed the image with ravenous efficiency. The asset was a certified blue-chip commodity. However, the internal audits revealed a disturbing trajectory regarding the biological casing. The chemical maintenance protocols were causing accelerated degradation. The scalp was a permanent hazard zone of weeping tissue and necrotic hair follicles. The cellular regeneration cycle was failing to keep pace with the weekly application of industrial bleach, ammonia, and peroxide. The immune system was heavily compromised. The asset was operating on a dangerous deficit of sleep, relying entirely on a cocktail of synthetic stimulants to maintain verticality on the soundstage. Hughes possessed the cold, calculating vision of a predatory investor. He understood the fundamental law of biologica. All assets. Flesh is not real estate. Flesh depreciates. The asset was approaching a critical failure point. If the internal organ systems collapsed while the contract remained in the Hughes portfolio, the financial liability would be catastrophic. The production delays would hemorrhage capital. The brand value would plummet if the public witnessed the physical deterioration of the product. The solution was elementary corporate strategy: divestment. The asset needed to be liquidated at the absolute peak of its market valuation, transferring the biological risk to a secondary buyer. Hughes surveyed the industrial landscape of Hollywood. He required a corporation with bottomless capital reserves and a massive production infrastructure capable of absorbing the asset. He found the perfect buyer, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. MGM was not merely a film studio. It was a sovereign industrial nation. It boasted its own police force, its own power grid, and an insatiable appetite for human raw material. The CEO of MGM, Louis B. Mayer, operated an assembly line that required a constant influx of fresh inventory. The negotiations were swift, devoid of sentiment, and strictly transactional. The asset was not invited to the boardroom. The asset was not consulted regarding the transfer of her bodily copyright. She was inventory stored in a dressing room, awaiting deployment. Hughes and Mayer agreed upon a valuation. The sum was finalized at $60,000. It was, by definition, a perfectly legal, contractually bound act of human trafficking. A billionaire exchanged a legally binding document for a certified check, effectively transferring the total ownership of a 21-year-old female organism to a corporate syndicate. The ink dried on the ledger. The transaction was logged. Hughes successfully executed a textbook divestment, locking in his profit margins and entirely insulating himself from the impending biological collapse of the product. He walked away with clean hands and a heavy bank account. The asset was physically relocated to the MGM compound in Culver City. The transition was seamless. She was unloaded from one industrial processing plant and immediately plugged into another. MGM operated on a scale that made the Hughes operation appear amateurish. The MGM assembly line was a masterpiece of corporate efficiency. The studio utilized a vertical integration model. They owned the production facilities, the distribution networks, and the theater chains. They also owned the personnel. The asset was assigned a new production schedule. The calendar was a weapon of mass extraction. The MGM executives possessed no intention of allowing their $60,000 investment to sit idle. They required immediate and continuous returns. The asset was slotted into multiple production pipelines simultaneously. The white-walled dressing rooms of MGM became her permanent holding cell. The clock on the wall dictated her respiratory rate. The studio controlled her caloric intake, prescribing strict diets to maintain the required geometric dimensions of her chassis. The lighting rigs at MGM were more powerful, generating a suffocating heat that baked the sound stages. The asset was positioned under these intense tungsten arcs for 16 hours a day. The makeup department plastered her chemically burned scalp with heavier synthetic hair pieces. They applied thicker layers of toxic grease paint to her epidermis to camouflage the chronic exhaustion settling into her facial musculature. The cameras captured the mandated performance. The asset projected the required synthesis of innocence and hypersexuality. The directors barked coordinates. The asset moved to the designated marks. The film rolled. The capital was generated. But the MGM assembly line was only the primary extraction mechanism. The asset was trapped in a dual meat grinder. While the studio consumed her biological energy during the daylight hours, a darker extra-legal syndicate drained her capital in the shadows. This secondary extraction was orchestrated through a parasitic familial connection. Her stepfather, Marino Bello. Bello was less a paternal figure and more a financial parasite firmly attached to the host organism. Hollywood Whispers painted a terrifying portrait of his extracurricular activities, suggesting he was deeply embedded within the architecture of the criminal underworld with direct ties to the Chicago Mafia. Industry legend dictates that he viewed his stepdaughter as an unprotected offshore account, establishing a shadow corporate structure to funnel her astronomical MGM paychecks directly into the hands of mob bosses, illegal gambling syndicates, and black market extortion rackets. Whether the Mafia truly operated as an unauthorized board of directors, declaring massive dividends on her flesh remains a dark industry rumor, but the financial extraction was an absolute documented reality. He assumed total predatory control of her portfolio. While the asset generated millions on the silver screen, and MGM deposited thousands into her accounts weekly, she possessed zero liquidity. She was functionally bankrupt. She was a hyper-productive engine allowed to retain none of her own generated capital, relentlessly drained by the studio during the daylight hours, and bled entirely dry by domestic parasitism in the shadows. The asset was trapped in a financial vice grip. The studio demanded her flesh. The underworld demanded her capital. She was a hyper-productive engine generating massive wealth, yet she was allowed to retain none of it. Her bank accounts were routinely drained to zero to cover Bellows' gambling debts and mafia obligations. If the asset attempted to inquire about her missing funds, she was met with psychological warfare and implicit physical threats from the men operating in the shadows of her household. The physiological toll of this dual extraction was catastrophic. The human body is simply not built to withstand constant, multi-front psychological warfare. During the day, the asset was subjected to the relentless pressure of corporate capitalism. The directors demanded perfection. The lighting cooked her skin. The grueling physical routine strained her skeletal structure. The heavy costumes restricted her pulmonary function. She was a machine, running far past its red line. At night, the extra-legal extortion commenced. The asset returned to a domestic environment heavily monitored by criminal elements. She was a hostage in her own home. The neurological pathways processing this inescapable reality were perpetually flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. The fight-or-flight mechanism was permanently engaged, but there was nowhere to run. The studio held the legal contracts. The mafia held the shadow ledgers. The asset was squeezed from both ends, a biological tube of toothpaste being forcefully emptied. The lack of sleep became a chronic physiological crisis. The asset could not achieve a natural REM cycle. Her brain was overstimulated by the amphetamines administered by the studio doctors to keep her awake on set, and her nervous system was shattered by the nocturnal terror of her financial captivity. The asset developed severe, intractable insomnia. The biological repair mechanisms that operate during sleep were entirely bypassed. Cellular damage accumulated at a terrifying rate. To force the central nervous system to shut down, the asset was prescribed heavy barbiturates. The synthetic sedatives crashed her brain chemistry, plunging her into a toxic artificial coma for a few hours each night. Upon waking, the studio doctors administered synthetic adrenaline to violently restart her heart and force her motor functions back online. The heart muscle was constantly expanding and contracting under extreme chemical duress. The cardiac rhythm was entirely dictated by pharmacology. The internal organs began to manifest signs of systemic distress. The liver, already burdened by the weekly influx of industrial bleach and ammonia from the scalp maintenance, was now forced to metabolize a daily cocktail of barbiturates, amphetamines, and synthetic painkillers. The hepatic cells were suffocating under the toxic load. The kidneys, the primary filtration units of the body, were working overtime to expel the chemical waste. Microscopic lesions began to form within the renal tubules. The filtration efficiency was steadily dropping. The asset was experiencing early-stage cellular necrosis, but the external packaging remained flawless. The MGM makeup department was a master class in visual deception. They contoured her cheekbones to hide the swelling from water retention. They utilized specialized eye drops to bleach the bloodshot sclera caused by chronic insomnia. They bound her torso in restrictive undergarments to maintain the specific trademarked silhouette, ignoring the severe bruising and respiratory restriction this caused. The product was functioning perfectly on the screen. The films were breaking box office records. The MGM executives celebrated their brilliant acquisition. The $60,000 investment was yielding millions. The shareholder reports were glowing. The mafia syndicates were equally satisfied. Their shadow extraction mechanism was operating flawlessly, funneling untraceable cash into their black market enterprises. Both machines were humming with extreme efficiency. The asset was the only component being destroyed in the process. She was a biological battery being drained simultaneously by two massive parasitic entities. Her brain was effectively sidelined. She was not permitted to read her own scripts, manage her own finances, or dictate her own medical care. She was a localized point of massive wealth generation, entirely devoid of agency. The daily routine was an industrial nightmare. Wake at 4 a.m., administer chemical stimulants, report to the studio, subject the scalp to the hairpieces and the adhesives, subject the face to the grease paint, stand under the boiling lights, execute the physical maneuvers, absorb the dialogue, suppress the exhaustion, suppress the panic, finish the shift at 8 p.m., return to the domestic prison, endure the financial extortion, administer the chemical sedatives, collapse into the artificial coma, repeat the cycle. The calendar pages turned. The films were released to massive global demand. Red Dust, Hold Your Man, Bombshell. The titles were splashed across theater marquees and neon lights. The public consumed the product with insatiable hunger. They worshiped the glowing ethereal image projected onto the silver screen. They did not see the failing kidneys. They did not see the chemically burned scalp. They did not see the drained bank accounts or the mafia shadows. They saw exactly what the studio engineered them to see. The MGM machine accelerated the production schedule. The asset was generating too much capital to allow for any downtime. The studio executives ordered the directors to shoot faster, to cut corners on lighting setups, to push the actors harder. The asset was shuttled from one soundstage to the next, often working on multiple films simultaneously. The costume changes were frantic. The makeup touch-ups were aggressive. The chemical maintenance of the platinum blonde hair was accelerated, increasing the frequency of the bleach and ammonia applications. The biological degradation was becoming impossible to ignore internally, even if it was successfully camouflaged externally. The asset began to suffer from severe abdominal cramps. Her extremities swelled with retained fluid as her renal system struggled to maintain osmotic balance. She experienced bouts of extreme dizziness and nausea on set. The studio doctors simply increased the dosage of the synthetic medications. They prescribed stronger anti-nausea drugs. They administered localized injections of painkillers to numb the abdominal distress. The objective was not to cure the patient. The objective was to keep the machinery running until the final frame of the picture was captured. The asset's immune system collapsed. She contracted a severe respiratory infection. Her lungs filled with fluid. Her breathing became labored and shallow. The studio refused to halt production. They brought oxygen tanks onto the soundstage. The asset was instructed to inhale pure oxygen between takes to prevent her from passing out under the lights. The cameras rolled. She delivered the lines, her chest heaving, her lungs burning, projecting the illusion of vitality while her respiratory system actively failed. The asset was entirely consumed by the industrial process. She had no identity outside of the trademark. The woman born as Harleen Carpenter had been completely eradicated, overwritten by the corporate code of Jean Harlow. The studio owned her past, her present, and her projected future. The mafia owned her capital. She was a ghost trapped inside a highly lucrative, rapidly depreciating biological shell. The extraction was total. The twin meat grinders of corporate capitalism and criminal extortion had processed the raw material to the absolute limit of its physical endurance. The asset was a walking medical emergency, heavily medicated, perpetually exhausted, and financially destitute despite generating millions in revenue. The system had successfully converted her youth, her health, and her autonomy into hard currency. The executives at MGM reviewed the latest financial projections. The numbers were staggering. The asset was the most profitable component in their entire inventory. They drafted a new, even more punishing production schedule for the upcoming fiscal year. They planned to maximize the extraction before the inevitable biological breakdown occurred. They calculated the depreciation curves. They knew the product had a limited shelf life. They intended to squeeze every last drop of profit from the biological casing before it was completely liquidated. A shadow syndicate also reviewed their ledgers. The cash flow was immense. They tightened their grip on the asset's domestic environment, ensuring that no capital escaped their extraction network. Both machines accelerated their operations, grinding the asset down with relentless mechanical precision. The stage was set for the final catastrophic system failure. The biological limit was approaching rapidly. The engine was about to seize. Spring 1937. The Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer accounting department opened a new ledger. The production code was registered. The title was Saratoga. The male lead asset, Clark Gable, was secured. The female lead asset, trademark Jean Harlow, was scheduled for immediate deployment onto Soundstage 4. The corporate timeline was rigid. The theatrical release date was already heavily collateralized by the studio's distribution network. The factory required its primary component to function, but the biological casing was in active, irreversible revolt. The human renal system is a highly efficient filtration mechanism. It is designed to extract urea, toxins, and cellular waste from the bloodstream, expelling the hazardous byproducts to maintain internal equilibrium. For 7 years, the asset's kidneys had been subjected to a relentless, unmitigated chemical assault. The weekly transdermal absorption of industrial bleach and ammonia through the scalp, the daily oral ingestion of synthetic amphetamines to initiate consciousness, the nocturnal administration of heavy barbiturates to force the central nervous system into an artificial coma, the excessive consumption of ethanol utilized as an unauthorized, desperate anesthetic against the mafia-induced as psychological warfare, the microscopic filtering units within the kidneys, the nephrons, had sustained 100% critical damage. The cellular tissue was necrotic. The filtration rate dropped to absolute zero. The biological waste processing plant shut down completely. This mechanical failure triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The condition is clinically classified as uremia. The toxins, unable to exit the system, simply backed up. They flooded the vascular network. The blood became a highly concentrated poisonous sludge. The asset was drowning internally in her own cellular exhaust. The external manifestations of this systemic collapse were impossible to ignore, yet the studio mandated complete operational denial. The earliest warning sign was the olfactory output. The lungs attempted to compensate for the dead kidneys by exhaling the trapped toxins. Her breath reeked of ammonia. It was not a subtle odor. It was the sharp, acrid stench of a decomposing chemical facility. The wardrobe department attempted to mask the biological rot. They saturated her silk costumes with exorbitant quantities of Chanel No. 5. The floral notes of the perfume aggressively collided with the heavy metallic stench of uremia, creating a nauseating, suffocating miasma that trailed behind her on the soundstage. The co-stars and the camera operators detected the scent of decay. They remained silent. Complaining about the scent of the primary investment was a breach of studio protocol. The secondary physical manifestation was severe edema. The fluid, unable to be processed and excreted, pooled in the interstitial tissues. The asset was swelling. The precise geometrically marketable curves that Howard Hughes had originally patented were distorting. Her abdomen distended. Her ankles ballooned over the edges of her custom-fitted leather heels. The MGM wardrobe supervisors were deployed to execute mechanical containment. They strapped the asset into heavy, reinforced corsets. They pulled the laces with violent force, physically compressing the excess fluid deeper into the failing organ cavity to maintain the required silhouette for the camera. The internal pressure on her already dying organs was immense. The asset's diaphragm was severely restricted. Her pulmonary intake was reduced to shallow, agonizing gasps. She was suffocating inside a tightly laced corporate straitjacket. The facial degradation presented the highest risk to the brand valuation. The skin, starved of oxygenated blood and saturated with urea, turned a necrotic ashen gray. The capillaries beneath the epidermis began to rupture, creating dark, bruised hollows under her eyes. The lips, previously the focal point of the marketing campaigns, lost all vascularity, turning a pale, lifeless blue. The makeup department was tasked with executing an emergency cosmetic overhaul. They were not beauticians, they were morticians, preparing a body for an open casket viewing while the corpse was still technically breathing. They spackled the gray flesh with thick, heavy layers of grease paint. They painted a synthetic, aggressive pink over the dying tissue of her cheeks. They drew a sharp, crimson bow over the cyanotic lips. They glued the heavy synthetic blonde hairpiece directly over the weeping, chemically burned lesions on her scalp. The result was a grotesque parody of vitality. She looked exactly like a painted wax mannequin, rapidly melting under a heat source. The production of Saratoga commenced. The ambient temperature on Soundstage 4 routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive carbon arc lamps required to expose the slow film stock operated like industrial furnaces. The heat accelerated the biological rot. The asset was positioned under these boiling lights, draped in heavy fabrics, her internal organs marinating in toxic waste. The slow-motion collapse began. In the darkest, most cynical corners of Hollywood lore, a fabricated, terrifying myth emerged about her final moments on set. It is a legend born from the very real cruelty of the studio system, a cinematic nightmare of how the industry treats a failing machine. The myth goes like this. As the director called for action, she stood opposite Clark Gable under the blinding studio lights. The asset stands opposite Clark Gable. The script dictates a specific exchange of dialogue. It dictates a smile, a projection of effortless magnetic sexuality. The brain attempts to send the electrical impulses to the facial musculature. The signal must travel through a nervous system entirely submerged in uremic poison. The blood-brain barrier has been breached. The toxicity disrupts the synaptic firing. The facial nerves misfire. A microtremor ripples across her jawline. She attempts to inhale. The tightly laced corset restricts the lung expansion. The oxygen deficit hits the cerebral cortex. The vision narrows. The edges of the soundstage blur into a dark, tunnel-like vignette. The ambient noise of the crew, the hum of the generators, the whir of the camera magazine taking up celluloid, fades into a distant muffled roar. The pain is no longer localized. It is a total systemic agony. The corroding kidneys throb with a dull, heavy density against the lower spine. The acid in the blood burns the lining of the veins. The skeletal structure yields. The knees unlock. The asset does not faint with theatrical grace. It is a catastrophic mechanical failure. Gravity asserts immediate dominance. Zoom in on the descent. The meticulously styled hairpiece shifts out of alignment as the head drops forward. The heavy beaded gown drags against the air. The painted face goes entirely slack. The eyes rolling upward, revealing the yellowed, bloodshot sclera. The impact. The knees strike the solid wooden floorboards of the sound stage. There is a dull, heavy thud. It is the sound of a 100-pound sack of defective merchandise hitting the pavement. The torso crumples over the shattered knees. The cheek impacts the ground, smearing the thick layer of grease paint against the dust and the electrical cables. She lies there, motionless. A puddle of cold sweat immediately begins to pool beneath her gray, trembling hands. The sharp, undeniable stench of ammonia wafts up into the hot studio air. Freeze the frame. Observe the reaction of the ecosystem. There are over 50 personnel on the soundstage, lighting technicians perched on the catwalks, focus pullers, boom operators, the director in his canvas chair, the line producer clutching a clipboard. There is no synchronized gasp of horror. There is no frantic, empathetic rush to the side of the fallen girl. The human element has been entirely bred out of the MGM assembly line. Clark Gable steps back, brushing a speck of dust from his tailored trousers. He looks down at the collapsed asset with the mild irritation of a motorist observing a blown tire on a delivery vehicle. The director does not yell for a medic. He yells, "Cut!" The line producer immediately consults the gold pocket watch chained to his vest. His pupils dilate not with fear for a human life, but with the sudden terrifying calculation of financial loss. A halted set on an A-list MGM picture burns through thousands of dollars per hour. The crew remains on the clock. The equipment rental accrues interest. Every second the asset remains non-functional on the floorboards. The studio hemorrhages capital. The mafia handlers, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the arc lights, shift uncomfortably in their tailored suits. They watch the source of their untraceable income twitching on the floor. Their internal ledgers are suddenly thrown into chaos. If the ATM is broken, the cash flow ceases. They do not view a dying stepdaughter. They view a breached contract. They view an unacceptable interruption to their extortion racket. The assistant director approaches the body. He nudges the asset's shoulder with the tip of his polished leather shoe. It is an investigative prod, checking the responsiveness of a stalled engine. "Get her up," the line producer barks. The tone is devoid of compassion. It is an industrial command. Two burly grips are dispatched from the lighting department. They hoist the asset off the floor by her armpits. Her head lolls loosely against her chest. Her legs drag behind her like dead weights. The corset audibly creaks as they drag her off the set. They dump her onto a narrow, hard cot in a windowless holding room just off the main stage. The makeup department is immediately summoned. They are ordered to patch the smeared grease paint. They are ordered to fix the crooked wig. The studio physician is called. He is not a healer. He is a mechanic retained by the corporation to keep the machinery operational at all costs. He arrives with a black leather bag filled with synthetic overrides. He does not take her blood pressure. He does not check her renal function. He does not recommend hospitalization. Hospitalization requires halting the production schedule. He observes the gray skin. He smells the ammonia. He makes the clinical assessment that the asset is in the final stages of renal failure. He recognizes that she is actively dying. He opens his bag. He extracts a glass syringe. He draws a massive dose of synthetic adrenaline and high-grade amphetamines. He finds a viable vein in the bruised, swollen tissue of her arm. He depresses the plunger, injecting the highly volatile chemical cocktail directly into the toxic bloodstream. The objective is to force the failing heart to beat faster, to violently shock the dying central nervous system back online for just enough time to capture the final remaining scenes required for the film's continuity. The pain inflicted by the injection is irrelevant. The long-term cellular destruction is irrelevant. The asset's eyes snap open. The pupils are dilated to the extreme edge of the iris. Her chest heaves violently as the adrenaline forces the restricted lungs to expand against the corset. Her heart hammers erratically against her ribcage. She is awake. She is chemically terrified. She is functional. It is a perfectly engineered, horrifying story. The reality of her departure from the production of Saratoga was quieter and perhaps more chilling in its absolute banality. There was no dramatic collapse on the floorboards, no ruthless syringe of adrenaline, and no forced resurrection to finish the final frames. The biological casing simply deteriorated in plain sight. The exhaustion became impossible to camouflage behind the heavy grease paint. She complained of severe crippling nausea and an inability to draw breath. She leaned heavily against her co-stars, simply to maintain verticality under the boiling tungsten lights. The machine did not violently shatter in a cinematic spectacle. It ground to a pathetic, agonizing halt. Recognizing the primary investment was entirely depleted and incapable of delivering the required lines, the studio finally authorized a retreat. There was just a 26-year-old girl suffocating inside a tightly laced corporate straitjacket, quietly walking off the factory floor for the last time. The central nervous system crashed entirely. The collapse was no longer a temporary mechanical stall. It was a terminal system failure. As her biological casing shut down, the remaining functional nephrons necrotized, permanently ceasing filtration and transforming her bloodstream into a stagnant reservoir of toxic sludge. The uremic acid levels spiked beyond sustainable human parameters. The studio executives authorized the immediate removal of the defective merchandise from the soundstage. There was no theatrical exit. The asset was quietly transported off the lot to preserve the brand optics. She was deposited into a private suite at Good Samaritan Hospital. The hospital room did not function as a center for healing. It functioned as a corporate salvage yard. The medical personnel were not tasked with curing the patient. They were tasked with mitigating the public relations disaster of a dying primary investment. The forensic reality of the hospital suite was gruesome. The sweet, heavy scent of Chanel No. 5 evaporated. The room was dominated by the sharp, corrosive stench of ammonia. The toxins were eaching through the asset's pores. The condition is clinically documented as uremic frost. The urea in the bloodstream crystallized on the surface of the epidermis, leaving a fine, white, toxic powder across the graying skin. The body was literally attempting to sweat out the poison because the internal processing plant had been completely destroyed by the studio's maintenance protocols. The brain was the final organ to surrender. The toxic blood breached the blood-brain barrier. The cerebral cortex was submerged in urea. The neurological pathways short-circuited. The asset slipped into a deep, unrecoverable uremic coma. The cognitive functions were eradicated. The woman known as Jean Harlow was gone. Only a failing body remained. June 7, 1937, 11:37 a.m. The ambient noise in the hospital room consists only of the mechanical hum of the ventilation system and the shallow, erratic rasp of the asset's respiratory intake. The fluid retention has reached maximum capacity. The lungs are heavily congested with unexcreted plasma. The alveolar sacs struggle to process oxygen. The breathing pattern shifts into the death rattle. It is a wet, mechanical clicking sound occurring deep within the chest cavity. The cardiac muscle, exhausted by years of chemically induced hyperactivity and synthetic stimulants, begins to fibrillate. The heart valves flutter erratically. The electrical signals regulating the heartbeat misfire. The blood pressure plummets. The vascular system collapses. The chest rises for the final intake of oxygen. The lungs expand marginally against the accumulated fluid. A slight pause occurs at the apex of the breath. The carbon dioxide is expelled through the cyanotic lips. The jaw slackens. The heart muscle completely stops. The electrical current terminates. The biological engine ceases. The eyes remain fixed and sightless beneath the closed, heavily bruised eyelids. The body temperature immediately begins to drop to match the ambient temperature of the room. Blood, no longer propelled by the cardiac pump, begins to pool in the lowest gravitational points of the chassis. Lividity sets in. The skin turns a mottled purplish black. The decomposition process initiates immediately. The asset has expired. The biological component of the trademark is officially dead at 26 years old. The hospital administration immediately notified the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer executive boardroom. Louis B. Mayer received the telephone call. He did not weep. He did not issue a statement of profound personal loss. He immediately summoned the head of production, the chief accounting officer, and the legal department. The primary concern was not the loss of human life. The primary concern was the unfinished inventory. The film Saratoga was 90% complete. The studio had millions of dollars tied up in the production overhead. The death of the lead asset threatened to render the existing celluloid worthless. An unfinished film generates zero revenue. It is a total capital write-off. Mayer refused to absorb the financial hit. The investment had to be protected. The executives initiated an immediate, ruthless salvage operation. The biological death of the asset was a minor logistical hurdle. The corporation owned the brand. The corporation owned the trademark. The physical corpse was no longer required to complete the manufacturing process. The casting department was deployed to source a replacement component. They scoured the inventory of background extras and stand-ins. They required a biological casing with identical geometric proportions to the deceased asset. They found a contract player named Mary Dees. Dees was not hired for her acting proficiency. She was hired solely for her physical dimensions. She was a functional spare part. The wardrobe department strapped Dees into the identical silk dresses worn by the deceased. The makeup department plastered the identical synthetic blonde hairpiece onto her scalp. The director adjusted camera angles. The cinematography was carefully orchestrated to obscure the deception. They filmed the replacement asset from behind. They filmed her in wide shots. They filmed her with her face hidden behind oversized hats and binoculars. The visual component was secured. The audio component presented a secondary complication. The dead asset could not deliver the remaining dialogue. The sound department bypassed the issue. They hired a voice impersonator named Paula Winslow. Winslow sat in a recording booth and mimicked the flat nasal inflection of the deceased. The technicians spliced the audio tracks over the obscured footage of the body double. MGM successfully engineered a cinematic Frankenstein. They stitched together the raw footage of the dying asset with the synthetic inserts of the body double and the forged audio tracks. They manufactured a complete distributable product using the fragmented remains of their liquidated investment. The assembly line did not pause. The supply chain remained intact. The final necessary protocol was the public relations deployment. The studio could not simply discard the corpse. The death had to be monetized. The funeral of Jean Harlow was heavily orchestrated by the MGM publicity department. It was not a solemn memorial. It was a massive, highly publicized marketing event. The studio paid for a lavish, ostentatious burial vault at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. The mahogany casket was draped in expensive floral arrangements. The executives, including Howard Hughes and Louis B. Mayer, attended the ceremony. They wore tailored black suits. They stood before the press cameras with rehearsed, somber expressions. They were not mourning the loss of a young woman. They were generating promotional material. The media coverage of the funeral served as a global advertisement for the upcoming theatrical release of Saratoga. The strategy was executed flawlessly. The public consumption of the tragedy was unprecedented. The consumer sea flooded the theaters, driven by a morbid fascination to witness the final agonizing moments of the deceased asset on the silver screen. They paid the admission price to watch a ghost. The financial return was astronomical. Saratoga broke box office records. It became the highest-grossing film of the year. The capital poured into the MGM corporate accounts. The initial $60,000 acquisition fee paid to Howard Hughes yielded millions in pure profit. The mafia syndicates collected their final untraceable dividends from the offshore accounts before the legal estate was settled. The ledgers were reconciled. The profit margins were maximized. The asset was completely drained, discarded, and buried under a slab of cold marble. The Hollywood Industrial Complex reviewed the quarterly earnings report. The Gina Harlow acquisition was universally deemed a flawless corporate success. The machine had identified a raw material, patented the trademark, subjected the biological casing to relentless chemical and physical extraction, transferred the asset at peak valuation, and successfully monetized the ensuing systemic collapse. The board of directors declared a massive dividend for the shareholders. The production line required new inventory. The executives turned their attention back to the casting offices. They began searching for the next chassis to strap into the silk dresses. They began ordering fresh shipments of industrial bleach, ammonia, and peroxide. The factory floor was hosed down. The dressing room was cleared out. The camera magazines were loaded with fresh celluloid. The operation resumed. The balance sheet was finalized. The transaction was officially closed.